Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this author discussion with Peter Schmitt. As you may know, it is National Poetry Month, the month of April, so we wanted to celebrate that by hosting this event today. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about him first, and then we'll let him read some of his poetry from his, I believe, from your newest collection, probably. And then we'll open it up for Q&A. So Peter Schmitt is the author of 6 collections of poems. The most recent is Goodbye Apostrophe, which was published last year in 2020. He has received the Levin Award from the Academy of American Poets and the Nation Prize, as well as the Julia Peterkin Award, is twice a recipient of grants from the Florida Arts Council, and was awarded an Ingram Merrill Foundation Fellowship. His poems have been featured on NPR's Writer's Almanac, and he is a winner of the Sunken Garden Poetry Festival Open Competition. His work has appeared in many leading publications, including the Hudson Review, The Nation, the Paris Review, Poetry, and the Southern Review, and been widely anthologized. He is currently editing his late father's World War II remembrance, Fairy Tales, a Navigator's Memoir, due out in 2022. He is a native Miamian and honors graduate of Amherst College, and graduated from the University of Iowa Writers Workshop. He has taught creative writing and literature at the University of Miami since 1986. So we want to welcome you this morning and let you take it from here.
Thank you so much, Abby, and thanks to the Florence Library for this invitation and opportunity. And thanks so much to the folks joining in. I'll wish you good afternoon, actually, here from Miami. I think it's still morning in Alabama, but good day regardless. And I'm going to guess, as Abby says, I'm going to be reading from my new collection of poems from Regal House Publishing. It's called Goodbye Apostrophe. And I thought I would open with the first poem in the book, which reflects a story that I shared with my creative writing students for a number of years before it even occurred to me to try to make a poem about it. And it speaks to the idea that poets, writers should never be afraid to confront the really difficult issues in their lives. It's not easy, of course, but to me, it's worth it. In the long run, the benefits outweigh the risks. It's a poem called The Sprinter. She ran track was all I knew, a sprinter, and wordless at the back, seemed no more there than on days away traveling with the team. Her poems predictable, perfunctory, all false starts and pulling up too soon, never exceeding the line minimum, skinny on the page and always the single rush draft, as if writing were a race to finish as fast as she could. Subjects pedestrian, tedious, forgettable, for her no doubt as much as the reader. Until one day late in the term, regionals looming, she dropped on my desk 3 solid pages of long, gripping lines, so much stronger than anything she turned in before, as though the language were compelled to rise to the occasion, and did, relaying with heart-stopped clarity just what her father had been doing to her for the past 7 years, and how no one knew, not even her mother. What I can't tell you, of course, is that from that moment forward, her life changed. He met justice. She found freedom, not because it didn't happen, but because it wasn't for me to know, and I didn't. And her writing the rest of that semester, as you'd expect, never as expressive again, nothing else summoning that force. But the poem had opened something in her as she passed it to a coach who notified counselors, and she kept on competing, battling, which is how I'll think of her. springing away from her blocks, arms and legs churning, the head down, then slowly coming up as she'd been taught. Well, that's a student, of course, who made an indelible impression on me eventually. Other students make impressions for other reasons. No doubt some of you out there are teachers, professors, and you know what I'm talking about. A lot of students you don't remember as the years go by. A few you do. Here's another one that I remember for different reasons, a little lighter, perhaps a little more comical. The poem is called Recommendation, and it's a sonnet. Her poem touched me, and it made me laugh. A sweet and witty elegy for her cat. And after she graduated, I wrote a long, enthused letter on her behalf when she applied to join the police force. Whatever possessed me later to Google her lines, finding she'd lifted them wholesale from an obscure British poet, my first thought was to write again to her sergeant. But then I stopped. She put one over on me, and I hoped she wasn't patrolling the streets, assigned anything dangerous or urgent, but using her true talents at a desk, investigating fraud or identity theft. Here is a memory that goes back to middle school, or at least back in my time, we called it junior high. This is, of course, in Miami, where I was born and grew up and still am, surprisingly, after all these years. This is called Fat Kid. 300 pounds in 7th grade and growing, fattest kid in school. Sit in the horn section nearly blocked my view of our director from where I labored back row on tenor sax. I could see his neck going pink, sweat slipping down dizzy Gillespie cheeks, eyes squinting as his stubby fingers worked the keys. We lived 2 blocks apart. The bus ejected us at the same stop. Slight, skinny me, Big Sid. That first week of school, we all saw it coming. And when some tall, long-haired jerk shoved Sydney in the dirt, a circle rapidly formed, and the coaches vanished like Darwinians, allowing natural selection to run its course. All Sid could do was raise his fists, but by then his glasses were broken, and he was bleeding and crying, and the crowd jeering. Tears stung my eyes, but I let no one see them. After that single vicious beating, some kind of equilibrium had been restored, a necessary order imposed, which all understood. Sid had to pay for his weight with a pummeling. It was that simple. And once endured, he earned a grudging respect. His tormentor, now that he had filled his function for us, meanwhile was relegated to pariah and dropped out in early spring. And so Sydney survived. The taunts continued, but with lower volume, less frequency. We learned our instruments, we rode the bus. His mother, who might have outweighed her son, kept to the cool back rooms of their dark house. But she had to be glad to see him with friends, even ones like me, as I would kid him too, once in a while, and he would punch me hard in the arm because it wasn't all right. And he'd make damn sure at least somebody knew. The new book is dedicated to my mother. And this next poem is in some ways, in my mind, quite central to the collection as a whole. And the material it covers is even central, I think, to my life in certain ways as well. The poem is called Fortune. About her brief, childless, dark first marriage to a man with a family fortune, my mother always kept very quiet. All I knew was that it ended in his threat to hurl acid in her flawless face, her friends hustling her out of town early one morning. No glance back, no contesting the estate, how she fled to Florida to start again. It seemed a long way from the life she shared for nearly 40 years with my father. And I was long grown when my mother heard that he had settled just a few miles from us, the first husband, in retirement, maybe. But more years passed, my father passed away, and the ex stayed silent until one day word arrived that he too had died alone on a houseboat moored on the Intracoastal, the body not found for almost a week. And only then did my mother disclose other threats made at the time. How he vowed to track her down. Before the internet, all you needed was money. And to kill any children she had. It shadowed her over the years at the mind's edge, waiting, and she could never have told my brother and me. Eventually, it would have grown familiar, less insistent, less probable, if never quite erased. For my mother, hearing of his death must have been like a rope loosening, a boat drifting slowly to sea. Here's the title poem from the new book, which I suppose kind of like a lot of poems kind of asks you to do some imaginative visualization. The poem is called Goodbye Apostrophe. Goodbye Apostrophe. You are barely hanging on at the top of the line by one curled fingertip. And now it appears you've fallen from the keypads of all the smartest phones. Forgive my possessiveness toward you. Goodbye turn signal, hiding behind the steering wheel, whatever indestructible composite you're made of, no one in this town seems to need you anymore. I don't know which way to go without you. Goodbye incandescent light bulb. You took up all my energy, but these sinuous newcomers lack your warmth, your hominess. When the rare idea comes to me now, what flashes on above my head? Goodbye, Mom. When I went to pick up your ashes today, a squirrel darted beneath my car, then came out the other side, unscathed, as if there weren't room in the world for one more death, however small. My light, my direction, mine. Goodbye. And it was a few weeks after my mother's death. I was just scribbling these little remembrances of things that seem to be disappearing. Punctuation, courtesy in traffic, at least in Miami. Old time light bulbs. Before it even occurred to me that what I was really doing, of course, was writing an elegy for my mother. It didn't register at first, and I am glad eventually it did. That I figured out what I'm really trying to do here, and your work, of course, you hope will tell you that eventually, even if you have no idea when you're first starting out. One more poem about my mom. This is called The Little Blue Purse. It was a little blue purse she had asked for, my mother, age 4, when her father called from the Mayo Clinic, with a silver chain. And he had somehow found one in a pawn shop in Rochester. And if he weren't so tired from the radium and the transfusions, from the talk of white blood cells, from the drive itself, that he might have noticed sooner that he'd left the purse at a small motel near the Canadian border. And so, with his family waiting for him, wife and 3 daughters, my mother, the youngest, at the lake at Winnipeg Beach that summer, he turned back, though it would mean many more hours. She was kept, my mother, from his funeral, and her own mother allowed no photograph of him in the house. But my mother kept the little blue purse in a trunk she carried into adulthood, with books and letters and clothes from her early years. And the trunk, too big for my parents' first apartment, was stored at my father's plant, where someone stole it. And the only thing my mother said she missed was the little blue purse, almost all of which had slipped from my mind out walking on the afternoon of her death, her body bagged and crematorium bound just hours before. And I had gone 100 yards more before realizing what I had just passed, sitting on a limestone wall at eye level, a purse that someone had discarded or lost, for all the world a child's purse, cheap, plastic, and a light blue. When we were kids, we would swear on our mother's lives. What do I swear on now? But when I came around again, the purse was gone, the sky just turning from clear to dusk. And that's about as mystical as I'm likely to get, I think, in my poems. My mother always used to complain that I never wrote poems about her. You've got poems about your father, you have poems about your brother, you've got poems about perfect strangers. And I would try to explain to her, Mom, usually poems originate from a source of conflict. So you don't really maybe want poems about yourself or that, or their elegies, but I don't think she ever really bought that answer. And I think even now she'd be saying to me, you could have written some of these poems while I was alive. I don't know. Anyway, here is a poem, again, shifting gears a little bit. This is about a next door neighbor of mine some years back. The poem is called Missionary. I suppose it's a poem about priorities, or at least as I hold certain priorities. Missionary. Before my next door neighbor left for Yemen to bring Christianity to the Muslims, she bought a gorgeous snowy Himalayan because she wanted some companionship and doubted her old cat would survive the trip. She hoped to find someone willing to adopt the 15-year-old Tabby, who'd been with her through everything, through the bitter divorce, kids growing up in a way, that time her car burned on the expressway. Behind the screen door, the old cat glared as my tireless neighbor dragged the upstart in a training halter around and around the courtyard. The youngster bug-eyed and gasped from straining at the collar. And while the stack of boxes grew taller and my neighbor was learning Arabic, the aging Tabby, who'd endured arthritic and asthmatic for years, suddenly fell sick with a spreading fungus and was quarantined to the bathroom. With her house in order, or at least her apartment in storage, my neighbor asked if I would take her poor girl to the vet and put her down. It would hurt her too much. I'll go with you, I said, not the words she wanted to hear. Next day, one last hello at my door. I'm off to the land of Allah, she said. Wish me luck, and God keep you always. That poem, incidentally, was in rhyming tercets, for what it's worth. Possibly you could hear them. This next one, again, I'll comment afterwards. Another poem with a Miami setting. It's called, although I suppose it could be set anywhere really. The poem is called The Ride Home. It was a mistake, probably, to give her the ride home she asked for. Approaching me out of the night as I pumped gas, this woman in her 40s, in scuffed high-top sneakers and mullet haircut. And she must have sensed me watching her from the corner of my eye, waiting for the knife or the gun to flash, to rob me or steal my car and leave me by the side of the road. Even when I bought her the Happy Meal at the drive-thru, I kept expecting something to happen as I followed her directions down streets I'd never driven. She didn't talk about what I would read 2 years later in the news. The father whose plane disappeared somewhere in the Bermuda Triangle. The mother who wrestled professionally. Her own stint as an amateur boxer. Karate black belt. 9th grade dropout. Shrimp boat mate. 50-story high-rise painter. The 27 arrests. Drugs, prostitution, burglary. No, she only went on about her daughter, worried that the girl's new boyfriend couldn't be trusted. She just had a feeling about him. I wonder now if she told me these things to put me at ease. A caring mother wouldn't hurt you. But I let out a breath when we pulled up at last to the address she called her own. She thanked me, then scribbled on a receipt her name, Sheila, her number, and said, for plumbing, painting, I can do almost anything. I never called it. But I have time now to also wonder if she approached him too, that final stranger, at a gas station, and got him to buy her some food and told him about her daughter. And only now does it occur to me that maybe she was the one in my car more scared. You wouldn't hurt a caring mother, but I wasn't the one who veered off course and left her corpse in a weed-choked vacant lot between a body shop and the railroad tracks. In the newspaper story about her death, they printed in color her likely mugshot. Hair cropped short, eyes heavy. She looks unhappy. But a black and white from 20 years ago shows her leaning back on a bench, hands taped, toweling hair matted to her forehead, yet pretty and smiling, while a trainer unlaces her ankle-high boxing shoes. She could be fresh from a sparring session, 3 tight rounds with the gym's most promising kid, giving as she got and thinking, I can do this. I can do almost anything. I sent that poem to the investigating detective, hoping he might pass it along to the daughter, but I have a feeling that never happened. Not exactly a high priority case, I think, for the department. Again, here's something a little bit lighter, and again, going back to junior high, maybe a little PG rated. This is called The Condom in My Wallet. I carried it for years before I lost, as we knowingly said then, the big V. like the coin of a country I wondered if I would ever visit. I think it cost a quarter from one of those gas station or junior high school boys' room vending machines, the male counterpart to the tampon. Though, if anything, it only increased the flow of blood through my veins, a promise, commitment waiting to be kept. And in class, sitting at that metal desk, I seemed to feel it pulsing upward through my underwear and pants. So exquisitely tuned was my backside to its presence. It was there in the first place, tucked discreetly behind the learner's permit and cherished bubblegum cartoon, just in case, as some guy had told me I might need it, as he had heard from another, and so on, an endless chain of raging testosterone-driven prudence, experience, wisdom. And in just what sort of emergency, I'd ask myself, would it come in handy? A stuck elevator? A fair young maiden trapped in the dimming, air-starved shaft with me? And succumbing to claustrophobia until I can save her by valiantly offering the distraction of pleasure? Did girls lug sponges, diaphragms, IUDs in that portable pharmacy called a purse? It wouldn't have mattered. The man prepared was the fortunate man, we had learned in Scouts. But looking back, the condom seemed more curse than talisman, languishing as the wallet slowly crumbled around it. Finally, one night, its moment arrived. But when I pulled it out, lubricated badly to begin with, the thing had ossified to nearly stone. When I stretched it in my hands, it shredded, and the girl just looked at me and shook her head. Preventer of pregnancy and disease, it had now prevented sex altogether, a newly discovered form of abstinence. Oh, thin repository of so much hope. The imprint left in imitation leather sized it up like a zero on a scorecard, batter out on stripes, ball still in the yard. If we have time, two more. Are we okay on time? Okay,
Sure.
great. Here's another one, actually, going back to this, in a way, to the same school, but covering a couple of different time periods. The poem is called History. On a walking tour of historic homes in my old neighborhood, we enter a house that slowly dawns on me as belonging to the family of a girl I knew in junior high. Good looking, intelligent, vivacious, and popular, and who died suddenly, not much after, in college, of a heart condition never diagnosed. She was editor of our ninth grade yearbook, so it's no surprise she's everywhere in it. And in my copy, she signed each photo, crossing out in one her face and writing, "I hate this picture." That year, she dated a Black classmate, when at the time, not one Black family lived anywhere in our town. And now I am walking through her old house, which I had never visited back then, just a boy from school, and into her bedroom, which her parents have evidently left as she might have last seen it. The lone twin bed, the Frampton posters, cramped desk, box turntable. Our guide is pointing something out, but I'm not listening. For just now, I am closer to her than I ever was, and am learning another kind of history of this house. Downstairs again, I introduce myself to her mother, who has been patiently waiting with a pitcher of lemonade for us to file through. She smiles and claims to remember my name. Next to the door hangs a large family photo with Beth standing front and center, her gaze directed just above the camera, taken likely not long before she died. I pause there briefly, and we resume our leisurely tour as our guide draws a line across his list of houses. And I will close this afternoon, I think it is now afternoon in Alabama, with a poem called "To His Coil Mattress." And some of your audience, I think, will maybe recognize the play on the title of the poem. I'm thinking here of a very famous Andrew Marvell poem, a marvelous poem, of course, from way back, the English poet Andrew Marvell. This is called "To His Coil Mattress," and I suppose it is a poem about the strange attachments that we sometimes make to inanimate objects, occasionally in lieu of attachment to more animate objects. To his coil mattress. Intimate of 1/3 my life, who after all closer than you. For your decades faithful duty, you've earned more than my gratitude. You have my commiseration. As surely I've been no blessing to put up with, or just put up with all those turnings and tossings, how you suffered my many moods, the haphazard hours I kept, the nights I lay awake with doubts, when others would have simply slept. I am thankful for your patience, your resilience. Every few months, I could literally flip your world upside down and around. Not once did you voice a note of complaint. For both our sakes, I would have liked to have given your springs and coils more frequent, vigorous workouts, the sort of pleasurable toil you were made for. But then again, whoever admits to enough? You had my back, my side, my front, when the absences could be tough. Still, it was inevitable, with me weighing on you each night for all those years, that you'd become, in time, depressed. How could you not? And to say I went to the mat, threw myself prostrate at dozens to find a replacement worthy. I know it shouldn't and doesn't mean a thing to you. You needed finally to move on. Tomorrow, then, when your successor arrives, you will depart not in sorrow, but celebrating what you've meant. Oh, launching pad of all my dreams, oh, cushioned float from dark to light, buoying me past what lay between. On this, our last night together, wherever bound when you leave me, I wish you a sleep as peaceful as you gave your life to give me. Thank you so much for your attention to these poems. And again, I would welcome any questions or comments from the audience.
Sure. I have a couple of questions.
Yeah, sure.
So I was reading on your Regal House publishing page about your background, starting out majoring as a pre-med major in science and spending hours calling home, wanting to switch to English. And I kind of had a similar experience starting out as pre-optometry, and it just wasn't a good fit, and then switched to English. So I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit more, and then how your parents ultimately came around to appreciating your writing and your background in literature.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's a good question, Abby. Sure. Yeah, let me be, preface my remarks by saying that really my parents were, really all my life very supportive in pretty much all the important ways. And I grew up in a house of books. Um, particularly my mother was a great reader. She told the story of how she took me the one time she took me to visit her Canadian relatives in Winnipeg. I think I was 5 years old, and I don't remember it exactly, but she says that when we walked in to someone's house, I looked up at her and whispered, "Mommy, where are the books?" And I admit that still to this day, it's the first thing I look for whenever I enter someone's place. And she claims she taught me to read when I was 2, and I was writing, I guess, not much after that. I'll have to take her word on this. But it was a tough a tough adjustment for really both myself and my parents when I rather abruptly pulled out of pre-med not long after the first chem exam my freshman year. And I was discovering that really I just, and I'd had this strong science background through high school. I'd been working for years on this major science project. And so all the signs were pointing, and had for a long time, that I was going to go into medicine. Even though I had dabbled in writing over the years a bit, I guess from my parents' perspective, it looked like I was just quitting. It looked like I was just taking the easy route out. It's first time really away from home for an extended period of time. I mean, I've gone away to sleepaway camp a couple of times, but this was the big time. There were a lot of distractions for a 17-year-old boy, hundreds and hundreds of miles away from home in a community, full of colleges and all kinds of temptations. And I'll admit that, that I was tempted, more than tempted. And yet, if I really was set on a medical career, I think I would have found it in me to buckle down. I mean, I think I would have had to have realized the kind of work it requires, and you have to put on blinders, and you have to be absolutely, committed to the work. And for whatever the reasons were, I wasn't.
Right.
And rather than extend the pain and the problems, I decided to kind of take a fairly quick bail on that. And so I ended up on academic probation at the end of my first semester. And my parents, well, why are we sending you to this, this elite college in the Northeast? And, all our dreams, since you were a little kid of going, into medicine, you just seem to be abandoning all of that. So it was, and this is before cell phones. So these were, long calls on the payphone down the hall, and, calling collect and all of that. It was an ordeal for many weeks. And I think eventually, I fairly quickly got into studying literature and writing, and I achieved some success even as a college student in that. And I think my parents came around to a degree. But for instance, by the time I graduated college, they told me, look, if you want to go on to graduate school in creative writing, and I did. They said you'll have to finance your own way there. So I took a gap year, and came back to Miami and worked and got the money together to eventually be able to go to the University of Iowa Writers Workshop. And I really don't think it was until maybe I finally started teaching full time. And then when my first book came out about 3 years later, I think by that point they figured, well, maybe he can actually make a career out of this. It's not going to be as remunerative as a medical career, but he seems to be making something of himself here. And I think eventually they were quite proud of whatever I was able to accomplish. My mother survived my dad by about 17 years or so, and especially she, I think she came to understand that it was the better profession for me. I think by late in her life, she realized it was ultimately the right choice for me, but again, a lot of, as you, I don't know, Abby, did you experience something similar? I mean, in terms of resistance from the home front?
I didn't have a lot of resistance on that part, but kind of like you, I did survive the first semester, but then by the second semester, I was failing my biology for majors class and just hated it. And I knew that wasn't what I wanted to do. And so I guess I was just on the phone with my parents trying to come up with a solution. And my mom said, "You've always been good at English. Your highest test scores were in English, so why don't you try that?" And I didn't really want to teach, so it was just from there trying to figure out what would I do with an English degree, and that's when we kind of decided I should pursue the library science career. So they were
Yeah,
supportive, but it was just, that changing your mindset of thinking you're starting out pre-med and that's what you've talked about for a couple of years and then having to switch totally.
yeah. I mean, from the time I was a really little kid, the thought was always medicine.
Right.
You help people and you make a good living. And not only that, but my father had my grandfather, my dad's dad, was a doctor, was a surgeon. And he really wanted my father to go into that field. And my father resisted and spent pretty much his entire adult life regretting that decision. So that factored into it as well. He didn't want me growing up like he had, spending his adult life regretting not going into medicine. But really, I mean, look, I mean, yeah, you know, teaching and and being a poet, you don't make a lot of money.
No.
That's for sure. But beyond that, I've not really had any serious regrets, second thoughts about the direction that I've chosen. In fact, I feel really quite privileged in a lot of ways. But that's a lot of what was behind it. Like most parents, they just want what's best for you,
Yes.
even if it doesn't always sync with your ideas. So, yeah. And you said you had another question?
So why did you specifically focus on poetry with, all different types of creative writing? I read that you first wrote a poem about baseball, which appeared in highlights. And so why were you interested in poetry first, even at such a young age?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. I'm not absolutely certain why. I mean, I think temperamentally, I'm more suited for poetry. I mean, I would love to really be able to write fiction, short stories, novel. I've worked on other people's fiction, short or long form, as an editor, as a first reader. It's been a very valuable experience to me. I really enjoy doing that. I love reading fiction. Um, I just don't know if that's where my particular strengths lie. And a lot of people said, "Oh no, you should write fiction." Oh, I haven't done it yet. Maybe at some point. Um, I think that first semester freshman year at college, uh, as while I was busy doing my best to get out of chemistry and calculus, I was also taking freshman English with one of the senior members of the entire faculty, and this was a man who had been a colleague at uh, at the college with Robert Frost. Knew Frost personally. There was a big Frost influence at Amherst College that I attended. And he introduced us to modern poetry, which seemed at times like almost like a foreign language. I mean, I knew it was written in English, but I really didn't know exactly what was going on a lot of the time. And yet I sensed there was something really important being said, even if I couldn't quite figure it out. But it was very compelling, and I wanted to try to do it myself. And and I started scribbling down, some some lines, I think probably, that freshman year, and then into the next semester. And I took a wonderful modern poetry course, just focused on modern and contemporary poetry. And that was very exciting. And I started taking workshops at the college level. And so, that just seemed to be, that seemed to be what was really grabbing me, and what I wanted to try to emulate. I think that's probably what a lot of people, do when they become writers. They read something that just knocks them out, just blows them away, and they want to see if they can do that themselves. And it happened to be really poetry. And ever since, it's been by and large poetry.
Yeah. Well, Sharonda commented that your poems are a lot like short stories, which is different from traditional poetry that she studied as a teen. And that's probably that contemporary influence that you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's something that's always been pointed out, that there is quite a strong narrative element in my work, and that is something I think I do respond to as a reader as well, is a kind of story in poetry. And that's probably why people have suggested, well, why don't you just go from verse into a prose form, which I understand, why someone might say that. It just it hasn't particularly happened yet. But yes, there is. I'm glad that you recognize there is a strong element. In fact, I even sort of think of my poems as a kind of hybrid of narrative and lyric poetry. I wouldn't exactly call them narrative poems per se, the way I teach certain narrative poems in my literature classes, but a kind of fusion, and that's not uncommon at all today in contemporary poetry. Lots and lots of people do that.
Mhm.
There is that storytelling element, but it seems to me poems, if you go all the way back to Homer, go back to the classic epic poems, they're stories. They
Yes.
are, they might be stories in long form, but there is always that. And when poetry gets too far away, I think, from that storytelling impulse, I think that is to poetry's detriment. I think poetry loses something when it loses the story element. So,
Right. Well, we've got a couple of comments. Sharana said she responded to it, and this is her first exposure, and she's really enjoyed it, and we'll read more.
oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Lizzie said she's really enjoyed this today. She said, it seems like you really pull from life experiences in your work. How soon are you able to recognize an occurrence or life event as a possible subject for a new poem? And what is that process like?
That's a great question. That's from Lizzie.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Lizzie, for that. Yes, my work has always tended to be autobiographical in nature. I hope at the same time that it has a universal quality to it. I'm trying to write about moments, events that others can connect with, others will relate to if they've not exactly experienced them themselves. I think it's rare that I recognize something almost immediately as the material for a poem. Sometimes that happens. People are always saying to me, "Oh, you've got to make a poem out of that." And I would say, like, probably, 49 out of 50 times that it doesn't end up becoming a poem.
No.
Once in a while, I might say, maybe so. But usually there has to be kind of a gestation period. There are poems that I've worked on, not continually, of course, but intermittently over 20, 25 years or more, actually, until finally there's sort of a breakthrough where you kind of finally figure out an ending or you make a connection. A lot of things have to come together for me to really create a poem. There has to be a sense of something significant happening. There has to be language that starts suggesting itself. Lines have to start forming in my head. And I try to keep them in my head as long as I can until there's too many there, till I run the risk of forgetting them and then have to jot them down. And then, I'm sort of brainstorming in that way. There needs to be almost always some sense of metaphor coming into play for me. That metaphor is still very, very important to me. I do think metaphor has lost some centrality in poetry. Again, I think that's to its again, that's to its detriment. Um, an angle of entry, an angle of approach to the material, finding the right voice. Um, uh, again, the shape of the poem on the page, so many things have to kind of coalesce before I can really start committing something to the page. Probably why I'm not very prolific. This is my first book in, more than a decade. I don't write all that many poems. I mean, I try to make each one matter, and I try to make each one as different as possible from the others that I've written in the past. And that I hope I'm following Robert Frost in that regard. That was one of his goals, was to make each poem as different as anything he had written before. And yet you read a Robert Frost poem and you'll still recognize it as a Robert Frost poem.
Yes.
Whatever the subject. And I'm hoping there'll be something sort of recognizably me in that poem, whatever the subject matter is. But I don't want to ever be predictable. I don't want anybody ever sort of picking up a poem of mine in a magazine or even in a book and guessing, oh, well, this must be another poem about, say, his mother or something like that, or whatever it is. I would never want to be a poet like that, where you guess, and odds are yes, there's going to be, there's going to be an owl in that poem, or this is going to be a poem about such and such, whatever. I would think the game would be over at that point if I was that easily figured out. I don't know if I answered Lizzie's question. I hope I did, somewhere in there, but
I think so.
I hope so.
Any other questions? Well, I'll end with one more question.
Sure.
So what advice would you give to maybe freshmen who are starting out majoring in literature or writing and just trying to get the words on the page to get started? What would you tell them?
Well, I could begin with a single word, and that word is read, which I would imagine anyone associated with a library would concur with as well. Yeah, I mean, you've got I think a lot of maybe beginning young writers today think that they can become writers without being readers first. That is a misconception. I mean, you can get maybe so far, but you need to understand that everything you write joins a very long tradition. Joining all the writing that's ever come before you. Again, going back to Homer and even before Homer, perhaps, and you have to sort of understand your place in that tradition. I mean, if you're going to be serious about your writing, I mean, again, if you really want to go somewhere with it, you have to understand the tradition. You have to read. Yeah, I mean, absolutely read contemporary writers, read poets and writers who are producing right now of your moment. Speaking to you from this moment, 2021. Absolutely. But you've got to read the older folks too, the older guys and women as well. You got to go back 50 years, 100 years, and more and more. I mean, I think every writer will probably admit there are huge gaps in their writing. Goodness knows, I mean, even though I've been teaching literature a long time, there are big gaps, certainly, in my reading. But you've got the rest of your life to try to fill in those gaps and to learn, and not just read literature, but read everything. I mean, read all kinds of things, and experience life. Get out there and do different things, and encounter different kinds of people, and just live life as fully as you possibly can. Your material can come from almost anywhere. I hope that you've seen, yes, I've drawn for the poems that I've read today on my own life, but they can come from newspaper articles. They can come from, they can come from other people's writing. I mean, a lot, again, as I said, the idea of emulating others. You read a poem or a story or a novel that you're crazy about, it will spur you to want to try to do that too. It might even give you some ideas as well. So creativity can come from virtually anywhere. Be open to it. You know, don't be afraid of any experience. I'll go back to the sprinter. You know, don't be afraid to take on even what you might not even be able to talk about with somebody. Because in my belief, it will not only be important to you as a writer, but it could actually provoke your best writing. And that's the part of the process that really excites me. That when you really confront something that's difficult, challenging, it will make you a better writer. I've seen it. Look, I've seen it countless times. So I know that that's absolutely the case.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you, Abby, and thanks again to the Florence Library and to your audience that's joined you here, and anybody who might be looking on in a recorded version. My pleasure, and I hope you'll have me back at some point.
We'd love to. I really enjoyed it. Maybe we could have you in person.
Oh, that would be great. That would be ideal. Looking forward to it.
Okay.
All right. Thanks so much.
Afternoon.
You too. Bye now.
Bye.